Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask the Experts Building a Hybrid Data Platform with Azure Arc-enabled data services. We have the team of experts today from the Arc-enabled data services team. I'm Dhananjay Mahajan. I'm the principal PM manager on the Arc-enabled data services team. And with me, we have Jess Schulz, who is a senior PM. We are both part of the same team, as well as Dinkar, who is a senior PM on Azure Arc-enabled data services. And then we have the worldwide customer strategy lead, Lior Kamarat, who is part of the customer success team. And we are here to answer all your questions. So any questions you have, please type them up in the Q&A chat, and we will take those over. And thanks a lot for giving us some good meaty questions. So let me start with Dinkar. Dinkar, these are questions that I hear a lot from our customers, and I'm sure you have too. Can I manage traditional SQL Server with Arc? What's the difference between that and Azure Arc-enabled data services?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for joining us today. In Azure, we have two categories of services. You have the infrastructure category where you can install a SQL Server in a virtual machine and you manage that SQL Server from patching to HA to DR to monitoring. And then you have the managed category of offerings where you have the Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL MI. In the Arc world, we have a similar categories of services or offerings where you have the Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, which is your existing SQL Server on premises that you manage from Azure. And you also have the Azure Arc-enabled SQL MI, which is similar to the Azure MI in terms of PaaS capabilities from built-in HA to DR to monitoring to all the cloud billing model to all the PaaS capabilities. So in the Azure, you have the infrastructure and PaaS capabilities offerings. Outside of Azure, you have the two similar offerings that you get as part of Azure Arc.
Excellent. Given that, that was a great overview of what these offerings are. Now going into the Azure SQL managed instance, Jess, one of the things I hear from customers is, what's the major feature difference between Azure SQL managed instance and the Arc-enabled product part of it, which is Azure Arc-enabled SQL managed instance?
Happy to take that question, Dhananjay. Again, thank you to everyone that joined us today. Great questions. We're looking forward to helping you out. There are very few differences in the features that are available in the Azure SQL managed instance and the features that are available in the Arc-enabled managed instance. Our goal is to provide one-to-one feature mapping. Right now, there's just a couple of things, log shipping and transactional replication, that aren't fully enabled yet. Other than that, you're getting the same database engine in the Arc-enabled services as you're getting in the Azure managed instance. In addition to that, maybe we'll talk about it in some other questions later, we're also offering a lot of the same PaaS or platform as a service benefits, like the backup service, the point-in-time restores, built-in high availability, and more. Great question.
Yeah, so practically we are getting almost the same functionality, Arc-enabled. Now, Lior, this one that I'm sure you've heard, do DBAs need to learn Kubernetes with Azure Arc-enabled data services? Is that a prerequisite?
Yeah, it's another very popular question, and like my colleagues, I want to say thank you to everyone that joined us today for this great session. So to answer that question, you really need to think about what is really required for Azure Arc-enabled data services, right? The fundamental building block is Kubernetes. That's something that we all know. Now, like many other personas in the RT organization, right? Whether it's developers or whether it's DBAs or just IT pros, the world that they are living in is changing by the minute. And as part of that change, Kubernetes kind of took over in the context of orchestrating this what we call cloud native practices and cloud native applications. And data services is no different. Now, because of the fact that Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes is the fundamental building block for Azure Arc-enabled data services, what I would say is that you probably don't need to know Kubernetes to the same level as a DevOps engineer might need to know Kubernetes. But with the primitives of Azure Arc-enabled data services and the fact that everything is described in code, everything is part of a Kubernetes manifest, everything is part of those Kubernetes building blocks that we have, like volumes and custom resource definitions and pods and deployments and all that stuff and services, you probably want to be familiar with the concepts to the point that you know how to approach this. Now, with food come the appetite, and I think that what we started to learn is that the more exposure that DBAs and data architects are getting into Azure Arc-enabled data services, the more they want to learn about the Kubernetes platform as their fundamental day-to-day infrastructure that they are running data services on. So I guess that will be kind of my perspective on if data architects and DBAs should know Kubernetes.
I see. So not absolutely needed to get started, but the more you know about it, the better off you're going to be. So while we're talking to you, Lior, another question came from Chris Black, and he says, happy Azure stacking. How much of the new Azure Arc-enabled data services goodness is also supported on Azure Stack Hub?
Well, it's a good question. And I think that if you look at the direction that we are taking and the way that we are approaching our Ed story and with the concept of Azure Stack, I think that the notion of Stack is moving towards more and more towards Stack HCI in the context of deploying and developing data services and other Azure Arc-enabled capabilities against. So I will say that probably right now it's a focus area that we're not really looking into the same way as we are looking at Azure Stack HCI. So I hope that answered the question. It's really about the direction that we're taking moving forward, and that's what you will see with all the collaterals that we are creating and all the scenarios and everything that we're talking about in this Ignite and in other places.
Yeah, excellent question from Chris there, and you're spot on. The direction we are taking probably is going to be more Azure Stack HCI. Now, Dinkar, this one's from John Flick. When you say log shipping isn't available, okay, that's what Jess said. Does that mean that you can't use Azure Arc-enabled to run always on setup, like on premises?
Yeah, that's a good question. When you deploy an Azure Arc-enabled SQL MI, there are two service tiers. There is a general purpose and there is a business critical. In the business critical edition, you get built-in high availability. And this built-in high availability is built on the always-on technologies that you already know and use today. So because the service comes with built-in always-on built-in HA, we don't allow you to take any additional log backups because that interferes with the existing log backup schedule that is used for the always-on technologies. Now, having said that, you can do copy-only backups. And the built-in service, there is also a built-in service for automatic backups in addition to the always-on HA. So you can do point-in-time restore if you want to. So the idea is just like in MI in Azure, you get these built-in capabilities to take advantages of, and you don't have to go and run these management tasks on your own.
Right. Excellent. Matthews asks, this one maybe is for you, Jess, if you can take this one. Any way to use Azure Arc inside a managed application, essentially being able to manage some of the customers' on-premises infrastructure. Is there any way we can do for a managed application?
So the beauty of Azure Arc is that in addition to Arc-enabled data services, we are also introducing Azure Arc-enabled application services. This allows you to take and build things like Azure Functions and web apps, both in Azure and again, on premises or in another cloud on the infrastructure of your choice. And those application services and any other application. So any application that you have can connect to an Arc-enabled SQL managed instance or Arc-enabled Postgres hyperscale group, just like any other database server. At this point, it just gets a connection string and the application connects to it. No special software, no special drivers required. So I hope that helped answer that question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Jess. Going along a similar line, Dinkar, of what we have been asking, one thing I have heard many questions say, many customers say is that, can I run Azure Arc-enabled data services outside of Azure on other clouds, other public clouds?
Another good question. I think the whole point of Azure Arc is for viewing and managing your workloads that are outside of Azure. And these workloads can be on-premises, they can be in a different public cloud like AWS, GCP, any other vendor or provider. So the idea is you have these workloads, whether it's SQL servers or VMs or Kubernetes clusters that are running outside of Azure, and you project these resources into Azure and view and govern and manage them from Azure, along with the rest of your other Azure resources, as if they are running in Azure. Now, between the infrastructure type and the PaaS type of offerings, there are some certain capabilities differences in terms of what's available and what's not. But the general idea is that you have these resources that are outside of Azure, and with Azure Arc, you can project them into Azure and manage them from Azure.
Interesting. And there can be any third-party public clouds that we have. John Flick asks again, Dinkar, again, thanks for answering that. I'll put the next one to you. So let's say this is a little bit of involved. Let's say I have two SQL boxes running enterprise in always on configuration. So does he have to redo them completely, or can those be imported into Azure Arc and then managed via that Azure single control plane like you just explained from that point onward? What does he have to do with the existing SQL that might be always on?
That's another good question. With the given existing SQL workloads that you have on premises, you have two paths to take, if you will, right? First one is if you don't want to spend too much time, or if you want to just go with the least effort path, you can Arc-enable that SQL Server, in which case you will install an agent next to it, and it helps project that resource into Azure. And you can see that resource in Azure, and you can run some security assessments and some governance on that resource, on that SQL Server. On the other hand, if you want to modernize that SQL Server, if you want to take advantage of the PaaS benefits that you get, things like built-in high availability, built-in disaster recovery, built-in monitoring, logging, provisioning, deprovisioning at scale, like all these PaaS benefits that you have in Azure, if you want to take advantage of those benefits, you want to install a Kubernetes cluster, create a SQL managed instance, and then migrate your existing SQL Server data into that new instance, and then you get all these benefits. So you can choose which path you want to go.
I see. So I will essentially have to migrate. I can't just Arc-enable an existing SQL always on configuration. That's a good nuance. Good question there. Now going to Lior. Lior, this one we hear commonly among many of our customers. How should we think about monitoring Azure Arc-enabled data services? What aspects should we take into account?
I think that the notion of bringing these services to outside world, right, or outside of Azure comes with, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that in the context of monitoring, what we're providing is basically we're providing two ways to think about this. One, there is the native Azure integration, right? So every time you are Arc-enabling a data service, either PostgreSQL or SQL managed instance, you're going to have Azure Monitor integration right off the gate. That's part of if you're thinking about this is part of the value proposition of Azure Arc. It's really about integrating with these first-party services that we are offering as part of the Azure platform. So Azure Monitoring is part of it. So that integration will be there from day one. Another integration that will be there from day one is kind of related to the question that got asked before around do DBAs need to know Kubernetes? And in the concept of Kubernetes, or in this ecosystem of Kubernetes, there are many, many solutions. There are many platforms, many extensions, many basically services that are part of that ecosystem that is Kubernetes, which is huge. But the two ones that are very popular and became kind of the de facto standard for a lot of the monitoring and log management solutions are Prometheus and Grafana, and also Elastic, which is Elasticsearch, which is basically log management solution. Now, Prometheus, Grafana goes hand in hand, right? One is the backend, which is the time series monitoring, and another one is is basically the UI that is on top of that provides all the dashboards and all that capabilities. And Elasticsearch is basically the log management capability. Those two capabilities are coming right off the box when you're deploying Azure Arc enabled data services. You are getting out of the box dashboards, not just for your data services that gets deployed as part of your solution, but also for your Kubernetes infrastructure. So again, kind of connecting the dots here between the first question and the second question, do DBA needs to know Kubernetes? Probably you want to know Kubernetes to the point that you can interpretate what you're seeing in these dashboards and be able to communicate that either your DevOps engineer or IT pro or whatnot. So those are the things that you want to think about in the context of monitoring Azure Arc-enabled data services.
Interesting. And monitoring is an important aspect of this. So given the choices that we have provided for Azure Arc, you have some there. Chris Black again asks, Dinkar, maybe you can help us with this. Are you looking into adding more database types to Azure Arc-enabled data services, or is it going to be SQL, MI, and Postgres? What about Cassandra? What about MariaDB? Are there other examples you have been thinking about?
Yeah, that's another good question. It's like you people are reading our minds, what we're going to do. So today we have a SQL managed instance as publicly available. We have two service tiers. We have the general purpose and we have the business critical. And in addition to that, we have Postgres hyperscale that we have in preview today. Outside of these two, we are discussing with other data teams within our organization, from Cosmos to MySQL to all the OSS databases. We don't have any specific database engine locked yet, but if you have any specific need or a strong use case about any of these databases, feel free to reach out. The more input we get from customers, that will help us prioritize which database to go with next, or which database to bring on board to Arc.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying, Dinkar, is that Arc has been built in such a way that it's a pluggable platform in which other databases, other types of data sources can also be managed. That's good to know that this is a very extensible system. Good questions coming in. We are a little bit over the half mark point. Please continue to send those good questions. I think we've had some really interesting ones. Now coming to you, Jess, the one that we typically hear some of the DBAs ask, like, okay, if Arc is doing all this, do I still need to do a backup and run all those administrative jobs, or does Arc take care of it?
So as a former DBA in my previous life, that is something that has been on my mind since I joined the PM team here. So think of this again as running an Azure PaaS offering in your infrastructure. So it's a little bit of a split. This means that we're managing some of the administrative tasks and you'll take care of others. Things that we're taking care of. Again, that high availability, as Dinakar mentioned earlier, that's built in. For example, in the SQL availability group, you don't need to build jobs you don't need to build all of that up. That backup service will take those backups for you. The point-in-time restore service allows you to simply say, restore to Sunday at 10:30 a.m., and it will take care of it for you. But other administrative tasks that are done inside the database to say, optimize performance or run any scheduled business logic jobs would still be the responsibility of the database administrator or developer. I think of things like indexing jobs, any data loads, that sort of thing. I'd be interested to hear from the audience if there are any tasks that you're taking care of currently, either in an on-premises SQL Server or Postgres instance, or in an Azure SQL managed instance or Postgres hyperscale task that you're curious about. Is there a specific thing that we can help answer? Throw that in the chat and we'll discuss it.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks who have joined, these are the experts we have. So any challenges you can think of on running your databases in a hybrid environment, a multi-cloud environment, please send those my way, and we'll be definitely be able to tackle many of them. So going with what we have heard, there's a question coming from Carl, and this one's for you, Dinkar. From the previous question on that always on that you just talked about, always on SQL, is it possible to use the Azure hybrid benefit to migrate 2x SQL standards into a Kubernetes cluster and then running those in the cluster with the hybrid benefits for Kubernetes SQL managed instances, which are then also have over with the Arc-enabled SQL Server? How does that work out, Dinkar?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if you can use your Azure hybrid benefits to carry over into Arc-enabled SQL servers, Arc-enabled SQL managed instance. Yes, there is a conversion ratio of 1:4, I think, if you're coming from standard to enterprise edition. But short answer is yes, you can use our Azure hybrid benefits to mix and match. If you have existing SQL Server workloads that you don't want to migrate but just want to Arc-enable them, you can use that. If you have other workloads that you can migrate to SQL MI and take advantage of the PaaS benefits, you can do that and get the hybrid AHub benefits, if you will.
Great. And I think that hybrid benefit is a tremendous discount, and many of our customers have been using that. So do take advantage of what Dinkar is just telling us. That's a great tip and good question. Now, Lior, this one comes from Mika. Mika says, "Hi, Lior. Good to see you. How do you see Azure Arc in 2 or 3 years in the roadmap? Is it integrated with other tools, or is it keep it as is in a corner?"
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If you're thinking about Azure Arc from a bigger picture perspective for a second, let's take a step back and what Azure was designed for. Azure was designed with hybrid in mind. That was something that has been there from day one. No secrets there. And we went through multiple iterations on what hybrid really means. It started with hybrid just means that we are connecting via site-to-site VPN from our on-premises to Azure, and that means hybrid. But we all know these days that that's not really what hybrid is all about, all the way to the point that today we are having conversations around Azure Arc in the context of stretching a control plane. Now, if I'm thinking about the next 3 years, to your question, Mika, I think that Azure Arc was designed to absorb everything that is a first party in Azure and bring it to the masses, to the outside world. And what I mean by that is, and it's more than enough to just look at the announcement that we had in this Ignite, for example, with Azure Arc-enabled Vim or vSphere, right? Although it's not a data services solution, it kind of shows you the potential and the breadth and the direction that we are taking. So I think it also connects to the question that Dinakar was answering around future database flavors that might be supported, and also the validation program that I was referring to around Kubernetes distros. And all these stuff are coming together to a point that you understand that the breadth that we're trying to take is really endless in a sense, because every time you're going to have a new Azure service, I think it will have the potential to become an Azure Arc-enabled service. So I think the question is not the next 3 years. I think the question is, what is the direction Azure is taking in general? So that will be my answer to this one.
Yeah. And And in some sense, it is our path to meet the customers where they are and then help them out along the way. One coming from an unnamed one. This one is for you, Dinkar. I think this is quite an interesting one. If Azure is managing HA, does that mean that the workload, the database that I'm talking about, is going to shift to public cloud if on-premises goes down?
Yeah, that's a great question. The high availability that comes as part of the built-in capability, it's all local HA. When you deploy the SQL instance, you can specify whether you want 2 replicas or 3 replicas, and all these replicas are local within your data center. In addition to this, you can also have one of the replicas in Azure. That's more like a DR purposes. We also have another feature called distributed availability groups that you can set up. Like if you have a primary data center where you have the always on with 2 or 3 replicas in the primary data center, and then you have a disaster recovery or your secondary data center, you could have another Arc-enabled SQL managed instance over there, and these two could be kept in sync via the distributed availability group. So that's more of the DR strategy. So you have multiple options here. You can go to the cloud or to the another data center, if you will.
Got it. Yeah, that really gives us the flexibility. Well, we are almost towards the end and we got some really great question. One final one for you, Lior. What is the best way to get started with Azure Arc-enabled data services? What kind of resources does the audience have if they want to get started?
Yeah. Azure Arc, if there is something that is outstanding in the context of Azure Arc and content that we put together, is the sheer amount of content that everyone from the product group from all over the place basically put together. Obviously, you have the Azure Docs. These are your source of truth when it comes to how to really get started and understand the fundamental building blocks of Azure Arc-enabled data services. At that point, if you've been following the Azure Arc space, you know about the Azure Arc Jumpstart project. When we created a bunch of automated scenario, we have more than 90 at this point, and also the RBox solution, which basically will give you a full-blown sandbox environment. So that will be another source that I will definitely go and check out. In addition to that, we also have new Microsoft Learn models. These models are designed in a step fashion, meaning that you can go and do things in your own pace and start learning. And we actually have a new Azure Arc-enabled data services model created by Bakwoody and Bob Ward from our team around SQL Managed Instance. So this learning model really will take you by the hand all the way to the point that you understand the bits, the bytes, and the architecture around Azure Arc-enabled data services and how to get going. And in addition, you can also go to Data Exposed, which is the show that runs by Anna Hoffman from our team, which is a great source of just hearing people that are developing this stuff and using this stuff and how they go by and thinking about this type of solution. So I definitely will recommend these sources of information. So please go and check it out if you want to learn some more.
Yeah, absolutely. Great sources of information out there to get started. I want to thank Jess, Lior, Dinkar for really being there, and also the team that was on the background helping us out with this, Joe, Giovanna, Ray, Barb. And thank you most importantly to the entire audience for giving us some really good real world questions to help you get started down the journey. We will include a link to a blog post that Lior and the team has created, some great resources. And I would second what Lior says, is that we have some great resources out for you to get started, start using them, start running your Arc-enabled data services on any cloud, and really start your journey around the hybrid cloud, multi-cloud future. So thank you again. Thanks to everyone. Excellent questions, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.